The colt was born under a strange, silent star, not on the manicured estates of Kentucky, but on a windswept, forgotten patch of land in rural Virginia. His mother, a serviceable mare with no racing pedigree, passed away soon after his birth. He was orphaned, but not unnoticed. Even as a spindly, unsure foal, he moved differently, a coiled spring of barely contained velocity. He was discovered not by a scout, but by a slick, sharp-eyed businessman named Arthur Sterling, who saw not a horse, but a future corporate entity. Sterling named him Meteor. The trajectory of Meteor's rise was less a career path and more an explosion. By the time he was 3, he was no longer just a champion. He was a phenomenon. His dark chestnut coat was flawless, his form a sculptor's dream, and his speed was an insult to the laws of physics. But it was his personality, his haughty, almost human disdain for his rivals, that made him a superstar. The crowds didn't just bet on him, they worshipped him. When Meteor entered the track, the collective gasp of 50,000 people was louder than the starting pistol. His fame became a gilded, inescapable prison. Every movement was monetized, every photograph syndicated. The noise was constant, not just the roar of the crowds, but the incessant click of the camera shutters that followed him even into the privacy of his luxury stall. He slept under specialized lamps, ate custom mixed mash developed by equine nutritionists, and wore blankets embroidered with his logo. He was a billion-dollar brand, and Mr. Sterling, cold and clinical, guarded that brand with ruthless precision. Sterling cared for Meteor's health only as an investment, viewing any display of weakness as a liability. The only man who treated Meteor like a living soul was Karl. Karl was an anomaly in Sterling's high-tech operation, an old-school caretaker, about 60 years old, with a deep-set kindness in his eyes and hands calloused from real farm work. He wore the same comfortable, familiar uniform every day, faded blue overalls over a plaid shirt, his silver hair always slightly mussed. Karl wasn't intimidated by the horse's fame. He saw the nervous quiver in the colt's lip when the press got too close, and the way the stallion would subtly flinch at the flashbulbs. Karl was the one who applied liniment and bandaged minor scrapes, often whispering reassurances to the high-strung star. Their bond was a secret, quiet rebellion against the stable's relentless professionalism. Karl knew the horse preferred the stillness of the pre-dawn hours. While the rest of the stable slept, Karl would sit just outside Meteor's stall, playing old, scratchy folk songs on his ancient transistor radio. This quiet ritual became Meteor's anchor, the only time he truly relaxed, resting his magnificent head near Karl's worn boots. This connection was profoundly heartwarming, a tiny pocket of genuine love amidst the crushing pressure of the industry. The pressure cooker was heating up for the Breeders' Cup, the biggest race of the year, promising the largest purse and a guaranteed retirement value for Meteor's stud rights. Sterling's mood was volatile, his focus purely on the cash prize. During a particularly intense training session on a cold morning, Meteor stumbled hard. It was minor, a quick, jarring misstep, but the horse finished the run favoring his left hind leg just enough for Karl to notice. Karl immediately alerted the chief vet, his voice tight with concern. The vet, however, was on Sterling's payroll and under immense pressure to keep the horse running. "It's just a strain, Karl," the vet dismissed, not bothering to hide his irritation. "A little soreness. He's fine to run." But Karl knew the difference between soreness and fear. He watched Meteor standing in his stall later that day, the magnificent animal shifting his weight almost imperceptibly, his eyes clouded with a distant, anxious look. Karl tried to appeal directly to Sterling, catching him as he was being whisked away in a luxury car. "Mr. Sterling, you have to scratch him. He's going to break down. You can see the pain." Sterling merely glanced at Karl, at the worn overalls and the worried, earnest face, with contempt. "Your job is to clean his stall, Karl. not manage my billion-dollar asset. He runs. This blatant dismissal was a knife thrust to Karl's soul. The sadness was overwhelming. He realized that Meteor was not just in danger of breaking his leg, he was in danger of breaking his spirit. Karl spent that night wide awake, huddled outside the stall, listening to the powerful rhythmic breathing of the trapped champion. He had tried to save him, and he had failed. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the disaster was now inevitable, a fate sealed by greed and arrogance. Karl felt utterly alone, staring into the darkness of the high-stakes world that was about to destroy his only friend. The morning of the Breeders' Cup dawned cold and indifferent, a stark contrast to the burning intensity of the stable. The air at the track was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cigars, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of high-stakes avarice. Karl moved through the pre-race preparation like a ghost, his usual quiet competence replaced by a heavy, foreboding silence. He saw the tension in every line of Meteor's body. The Colt, usually so proud and dominant, was jumpy, his ears constantly rotating, his nostrils flaring wide. He was reacting not to the crowd, the great noise was still hours away, but to the deep, aching pressure he knew was coming. Mr. Sterling, draped in a bespoke silk suit, was a whirlwind of calculated confidence, surrounded by his entourage of corporate backers. He barely spared a glance for the horse, treating the magnificent creature as a mere vehicle for his portfolio. Sterling's only concern was the visual, the shine of Meteor's coat, the symmetry of his braid, the perfect placement of the gold sponsor logos on his blinkers, when Karl attempted one last, desperate appeal, pointing subtly to the barely noticeable slight hitch in Meteor's stride during the walk to the saddling paddock. Sterling cut him off with a chilling finality. "Stop being superstitious, Karl. I've insured this animal for $500 million. He's structurally perfect. If you can't handle the pressure of the big leagues, stay in the barns." Karl stepped back, his heart sinking, the old plaid shirt feeling heavy with shame and defeat. He looked into Meteor's wide, intelligent eyes and offered the only comfort he had left, a slow, loving stroke to the star on his forehead, a silent apology whispered over the pounding of the horse's heart. The bell rang, and the race began. For the first few minutes, Meteor was perfection, a breathtaking vision of speed and controlled power. He burst from the gates, immediately claiming the lead. The crowd erupted, a deafening, unified shriek of excitement. He moved like a dark phantom, gliding over the track, his muscles rippling under his tight, glistening skin. The jockey, riding the wave of adrenaline, urged him to extend his lead, pushing Meteor beyond the point of comfortable speed, demanding a record-breaking performance. And Meteor, the champion, obeyed, digging deep into his reserve, ignoring the sharp, insistent pain that was beginning to blossom in his left hind leg. He was running not for glory, but out of the sheer, ingrained habit of winning, a desperate effort to satisfy the ravenous demands of the track. The race was almost won. As Meteor entered the final fateful turn, the notorious stretch known for separating the legends from the pretenders, he was 5 lengths ahead. The victory was certain, the headlines already written. But as he planted his weight for the final push, the compromised tendon gave way. It wasn't a spectacular collision or a dramatic fall. It was worse, a sickening, muffled pop, swallowed instantly by the crowd's roar. Meteor's perfect stride dissolved into a jarring, lurching stagger. The powerful propulsion vanished, replaced by the pitiful, broken rhythm of a lame animal. He fought the pain for a terrifying half-second, his will trying to overcome his broken body before finally giving up the fight, stopping dead, his head drooping in exhaustion and shame, his left hind leg dangling uselessly. The roar of the crowd choked into a stunned, horrified silence, a void more terrifying than the noise. The moment the victory was stolen, the press corps reacted not with pity, but with a renewed, predatory intensity. Cameras descended, capturing every agonizing detail of the shattered champion. Ricardo quickly dismounted, his face twisted in disbelief and anger, screaming at the horse for the money that had just slipped through his fingers. Mr. Sterling arrived seconds later, his silk suit suddenly crumpled, his face a mask of pure, devastating financial loss. There was no grief, no empathy, only calculation of the ruin. "Get him off the track! Clean this up!" He barked at his staff, furious that his asset had ruined his perfect day. But before the veterinarians could reach him, Karl was there. The old farmer had raced across the track, ignoring security and the shouting press. He knelt in the dirt beside the immobilized giant, placing a protective arm around his neck. Meteor let out a soft, low whicker, the sound of a broken spirit, and leaned his heavy head into the familiar, comforting fabric of Karl's plaid shirt. It was the deepest, saddest moment of the horse's life, a culmination of all the stress and pressure. Karl held him, shielding him from the relentless lenses, his own eyes burning with fury and devastating sorrow. He was the only one there who saw not $500 million of broken machinery, but a magnificent creature betrayed by human greed. The injury was severe, career-ending. The golden colt was immediately worthless to the racing world. Within hours, Sterling arranged for Meteor to be shipped in secrecy to a distant rural breeding farm, a necessary step to salvage his stud potential, but devoid of any warmth. The cold, rapid efficiency of the stable's abandonment was a final, painful blow. That night, under the cover of darkness, Meteor was loaded onto a trailer, leaving the glittering track and the brutal spotlight forever. Karl, unable to stand the hypocrisy of Sterling's world any longer, quietly resigned. He didn't ask for a reference or a severance package. He simply told the head stable hand, "I'm going where he goes. He needs one honest man." His overalls and plaid shirt were the only constants Meteor had left in the sudden shattering void of his former life. The journey to the new farm was long, silent, and steeped in the profound grief of loss. When they arrived at the remote, unnamed ranch, the contrast with the sterile opulence of the racing circuit was absolute. Here, the air smelled only of pine, fresh hay, and honest dirt. The only sound was the wind and the distant call of a hawk. Meteor was placed in a spacious, simple wooden barn, his view now consisting of rolling green hills, not concrete walls and camera lenses. But the change of scenery did nothing to lift the horse's spirit. For weeks, he was withdrawn, his recovery hampered by deep, emotional trauma. He was stiff, sullen, and often stood in the corner of his paddock, his injured leg trembling, perpetually facing away from the sun. The silence that had once been his escape was now a constant, painful reminder of the life and glory he had lost. Karl was the architect of this new beginning. He built a small cabin adjacent to the barn, ensuring he was always within earshot. He rejected the high-tech medical protocols and returned to the patient, simple methods of the old days. He was always there, dressed in his familiar plaid shirt and weathered overalls, tending to the severe tendon injury with methodical patience, gently changing the dressings, massaging the atrophy away, and leading the stallion on agonizingly slow, short walks. Crucially, Karl refused to pity Meteor. He never talked about the races or the fame. Instead, he talked about the weather, the quality of the hay, and the antics of the neighboring deer. This steady, non-judgmental companionship was the true medicine that began to mend the fractured spirit of the golden colt. The heartwarming moments of recovery were subtle and earned. The first major turning point came 6 weeks into their exile. Karl was sitting on a bale of hay, quietly humming one of his old folk tunes, the ancient transistor radio resting beside him, barely audible. Meteor, usually pacing nervously, suddenly stopped. He turned his head. his ears flicking back and forth, listening not to the tune, but to the steady, unmoving presence of his friend. Slowly, tentatively, he walked toward Karl. He didn't ask for food. He didn't demand attention. He simply rested his massive, perfect head against Karl's chest, pressing his muzzle into the soft plaid shirt, and stood there for a long time, letting out a deep, shuddering sigh of pure, unconditional surrender. It was the moment Meteor finally acknowledged that he was safe, that his value was no longer tied to his speed. Over the next year, Meteor transformed. The anxiety faded, replaced by a quiet, dignified confidence. The injured leg healed surprisingly well, leaving him with a slight stiffness, but allowing him to trot and even perform short, joyful canters across the pasture, runs done purely for the love of movement, not the finish line. He embraced his new role as a breeding stallion with an unexpected, almost paternal tenderness. He was gentle with his mares, and his foals were born with his magnificent star and, occasionally, his famous burst of speed. His legacy was no longer about his own broken record, but about the future he was now creating. The gold of his former life was replaced by the deep, satisfying green of the peaceful fields. Karl remained Meteor's shadow and sanctuary. He taught the young hands at the breeding farm that respect and kindness yield more than whips and fear. On quiet evenings, they would often stand together at the fence line, watching the sun set over the distant hills. Karl would lean on the fence post, and Meteor would rest his chin lightly on the man's shoulder. Sometimes, a tourist who recognized the famous star would drive by. If a camera flashed, Meteor would merely lift his head in a dignified salute, no longer flinching, no longer afraid. He had traded the crushing weight of global expectation for the simple, profound weight of a loving hand. Mr. Sterling, stripped of his racing star, tried to maintain his wealth through Meteor's stud fees, but the market was fickle, and his reputation for callousness followed him. He faded into obscurity. Ricardo, the jockey, retired early, unable to reconcile his greed with the broken image of the Colt. Their stories ended in disappointment and bitterness. But for Meteor and Karl, the old man in his comfortable overalls and the magnificent horse with his scars, their story ended in a rare, perfect peace, a testament to the fact that the greatest victories are often the ones won in the quiet sanctuary of the heart, far from the blinding lights of fame.